This lecture is about inclusive philosophy, process and practice. So inclusive education can be thought of as a philosophy, as a process and a practice, and we're going to be thinking about these in this week's lecture. I spend a lot of time in Singapore and I love being there. One of the very interesting things about Singapore is that they have a different approach to education in terms of inclusion. Though they are very much leaders in education in many international measures such as the PISA and TIMSS results, but they're keen to learn from us about how to do inclusion. And a few years ago I was working in Singapore and visiting a lot of schools. And one of the schools where I went to, the principal was quite intrigued by my daughter, who you met last week, and she was intrigued that she was in a regular school in primary level. And this principal said to me, but how does she cope? And it struck me that it's not about Ruth coping. It was actually about how the school where she was making school accessible for her, and they were doing a really terrific job. So we have some things that we do very, very well in inclusion, in learning how to meet the needs of all learners. And we've still got a lot to learn, of course.
We're going to be considering some concepts that we'll be picking up throughout this course. So in this particular lecture, it's really an introduction to some important concepts that we will be working through. The most critical is, what do we mean by inclusive education? And it is certainly not a synonym for special education. It's something that is quite different, and yet too often we hear it as a synonym.
So if we now think about what would make an inclusive classroom, I want you to spend a few seconds just imagining what would it look like. You might like to jot down some ideas as you think. So imagine that you're walking past a classroom and you have a look in. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you sense? Who is in the room? How many students are there in the room? Who are the adults? What is the teacher doing? You might like to think about who the teacher is working with. What are the students doing? Have a think about that and jot down some ideas.
It's quite common in Australian classrooms to see more than just a teacher, more adults in the room. Probably more common in the primary years than in the secondary years. But certainly you may well see another teacher. You could have a learning support teacher. You might have somebody with special ed qualifications. You might have somebody there as a resource teacher. You might also see a learning support teacher or a teacher aide. If you have a teacher aide, they may not necessarily be working with one student. They are more likely to be seen working with a group of students. They're there to support the teacher, and so they may be working with looking over the whole class while the teacher's working with an individual or a small group that might need extension or extra support to learn. Australian classrooms are very dynamic places, and there are lots of people in them, and you probably had that in your list.
It is important that we all get to be clear about what we mean by inclusion, because this is a word that has lots of different ideas around it. We want to be clear that in our course we're going to be talking about inclusion, as we can see in the definition that's provided here by Thousand and Vila. I really like this one because it talks about the supporting the learning needs of all students. It means that we welcome them, value them, and support them in their general environments. So we've got this general classroom environment, not in isolated, segregated situations, but all students together, and that we welcome and value their contribution. I also like this addition that Swinton provides. If you belong, you will be missed. Isn't that lovely? That it's a very thought that if there's a student missing, we'll notice them. And that means that they're included and they belong. When we think about inclusive education, we can consider what Konza wrote in 2008, that we want to remove the distinction between special and general education, because in inclusive education we're providing an appropriate education for all students. Now, it's despite their disability, and I'd also like to add despite their location, because in my view special education is not a place, it's actually about the education we provide. And I've heard some researchers claim that all education is special, and in a way it is. So we want to be thinking about inclusion in that way. If you look at this definition here, this is adding to our concept. Students with disabilities being educated in the general classroom and having full access to the general education curriculum. Now, we're going to come back to this idea of the general education curriculum for all students with disabilities, but they've also got to have the supports that they need, and in some situations those supports aren't provided. When we think about inclusive education, there is quite a lot of writing in this area where people are thinking about it in terms of the sociology of it, and there are some references that would be worth pursuing if you're interested in considering this area. There's been a lot of work in recent times thinking about, well, if we know how to do inclusive education, why doesn't it happen more commonly? We can refer you to references should you wish, but this one here by Slee is talking about this political struggle and this idea of changing the dominant culture as one of the features. If we think about Fallen's work, he talks about it's a contentious term, and that's what I was referring to at the beginning when I was saying that we really wanted to clarify that we were talking about a term with a particular definition, because there is such a lot of misconception and confused practice. I've heard of people talking about an inclusive classroom, and when I went to observe it, the child with the disability was not only not in the classroom, it was actually in a different building taught by someone completely different. But it's hard to understand how that could be considered inclusive education in any form, and yet that's how it was being described. So if we consider what inclusion is not, we would like to argue that it is not segregation in special schools or units or classes. Not to say that these things don't have their place, but we are just quite clear that this is not what we're referring to when we're talking about inclusive education. Mainstreaming is another term, and it's probably a term you don't hear all that often anymore. It was about when students were enrolled but no adjustments, so it was up to them to cope, and they could be there so long as they could manage. Integration is not what we're talking about either. So this is where they're in the same classroom, but they're doing different work. They might be isolated from other students, so their table might be put at the back or behind a wall divide, or they could be being taught by a teacher aide, separated and doing different work. That's integration, and it's not what we mean by inclusion. We also aren't referring to a practice that's been called co-location. It's also been called micro-exclusion. In this situation, we have students who only come into the classroom for some lessons, so they might be there for art or drama, but they're not there for Japanese or mathematics or some of the other lessons. It could be that they're just attending some classes, particularly in the secondary school, or they're only allowed to come on certain days when the teacher aide is there. I've heard of common situations where parents are asked to come and take the child home at lunchtime because that's when the aide goes home. All of those things are not inclusion. There are some key points that arise in literature about studies on inclusive practice. One of the things that is very clear is that learners with disabilities learn best in inclusive classrooms. It's not to say that they don't learn in other contexts, because they learn anywhere they're taught. But what it does mean is that they learn best in inclusive classrooms. One of the key findings for me is that other learners in the class benefit too. There'd been a concern initially that if you had students with disabilities, particularly learning difficulties and intellectual disabilities, where they're a long way behind the attainment of their peers, that you'd somehow be causing the other students to suffer. And we wouldn't want that to be the case. That would be really malpractice. And it's good news that research studies have confirmed that other learners in the class benefit too. And then at a broader level, inclusive schools that are doing the job well are good schools overall. They have improved outcomes, and so it can be a significant goal for school improvement to improve inclusive practice. And we remind you that inclusion is more than just being in the same room. So it might be one thing for the school administration to enrol students, but then having good inclusive practice needs to follow. And that's one of the things that we'll be working on in this course. Let's consider for a moment Maria Montessori, because one of the things that Maria Montessori noticed was that methods that she developed for educating children with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, were applicable to all children. Now, she was a doctor working at the turn of the 20th century, and she'd been highly trained in observational techniques. She was working in children's homes where they'd been placed, adopted for adoption and so on. And her work was to notice that these children really loved learning and were capable of it. And at this time it was considered that people with intellectual disabilities of any sort of level, but certainly beyond a mild disability, were incapable of being taught. There used to be categories that considered whether you were trainable or educable, or neither. So her work was really far-sighted, and it's probably not a surprise that it's had such a strong uptake around the world. And Karen told the group that she was one of the people that recognised that children needed small furniture, for example. So by really noticing the needs of children and responding to them, she was able to make great strides, and it's worth, I think, recognising her contribution. Well, we move now to think about what do we mean when we're talking about inclusive education and curriculum. Remember that we're talking about not just having the children in the classroom, but it's actually about the curriculum that they are going to engage with. So if we think about what curriculum is, there's the taught curriculum, and then the documents around that tell us what we are to do and how it'll be assessed. And it also can sometimes provide some guidance about preferred approaches. Now, our Australian curriculum is of a new form, and that does just that. Now, as you have in your readings, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, there's a clear indication in there that education is a human right. You would be aware of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because there's a link to that on the Blackboard site, and if you haven't had a chance to get to that yet, it's worth having a good look through the convention, but in particular that there's an entire article devoted to education, and a clear part of that is about inclusive education. In the US, there have been laws that require teachers to ensure students have access to the general curriculum, and again, that's not just being there, having it taught in front of them. They actually have to engage with it and be assessed on it. So that led to quite a lot of innovative practice that has allowed us to learn from it. Other rights-based ideas have come out of places like Italy. Italy has never had, or hasn't had, a special schooling system since the 1970s, and they've just developed a tremendous amount of innovative practice. In Australia, we have the Disability Discrimination Act, and if you've had the chance to have a look at it, it's just the way law is, and it's the language, I think, takes a very particular aspect of training to be able to make sense of it. So to assist teachers and other education professionals to understand their obligations under the DDA, we produced the Disability Standards for Education, dated 2005. There has been a review of the DSE, and they haven't yet been, as far as we're aware, they have yet to release the revisions. So these are still the standards that we have.
What I'd like you to do now is to stop and have a look at some of these documents. Have a look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, particularly the section relating to education. Then have a look at the Disability Discrimination Act if you want to. It's pretty dense legislation, but I think focus more on the Disability Standards for Education. That's subordinate legislation that is of great relevance, and it's much more accessible in my view. Then also have a look at the Australian curriculum and have a look at some of the approaches to educational adjustments. Look for education information in each of these and have a think about the significance. Have a look in particular at how the International Charter Convention has been adapted into Australian contexts.
The next few slides have some of the important aspects of the Disability Standards for Education. So I'm not going to read them to you. I suggest that you might pause the presentation here and have a read through them, or look at them in the standards directly. So if we have a look at some of the really important terminology and some of the key ideas, same basis, reasonable adjustments, and consultations with students, parents and carers. These are ones that have been very important in, specifying what's key in these standards. It's also been the part where the people have had the greatest difficulty in understanding their obligations. So here are some important points about on the same basis, and I encourage you to pause here and have a read of them. You'll notice this age equivalent content, and that's where I would suggest why I consider year level content is a preferred term, but that's clearly what I'm meaning is what the Australian curriculum's meaning about teaching the children at the level that they are in their classroom. Consultation is another one where I'd like you to pause this and have a read through these different points. Consultation, considering what that might mean in consulting with all the different players, is very interesting. Think about how you do that with students. I've just been finishing reading a thesis where the researcher spoke with students about their opinions about the adjustments that have been being made, and one student was that she really detested these special workbooks that had been prepared for her by the teacher. You can imagine that the amount of work that the teachers put into those. It probably been quite devastating to find out that the student really hated them. Consultation may come some way to hearing what students think of adjustments that are being made and how they could be made better. Reasonable adjustments is also a key principle that is worth stopping the recording and reading through. You might also have a look at the standards and read through those, because we are required to make reasonable adjustments. It's a very important aspect. And there's a great long list here of instructional adjustments, but it says may include, and we're going to be looking at this and possible ways of adjusting instruction and the education that we provide throughout this course. And you will no doubt have your own list of things that are possible, and you will also no doubt be creatively thinking of alternatives and new ways of adjusting work for learners. And this is really one of the places where teachers can bring out their creative side.
Environmental adjustments are another way of thinking about how we help students access the learning. If we make an environment welcoming and supportive, that's an educational adjustment in itself. Hannah Zazi, a research student with me last year, did a fascinating study on the physical environment in a classroom for students on the autism spectrum, and things that we'd thought would be engaging and exciting and interesting. For some of the children, they reported feeling physically sick in those rooms, so that was quite confronting for us. It's worth thinking about what sort of classroom we provide for our learners. One of these adjustments, and you see it there, physical access, it was one of the early tests of the Disability Discrimination Act. It was found that schools could not claim that installing a lift was unnecessary hardship, because it was argued that the lift was not benefiting just that student, but would benefit students through for years to come. And so that's certainly not considered an excuse for not providing access. And there are some others there that you can have a look at, but these are important considerations in education.
I'm now going to talk about a research study that I did with my colleague Barbara Clark from Monash University, and we were looking at inclusive primary mathematics classrooms and seeing what teachers did in those environments. We were learning from expert teachers, though they didn't consider themselves in that light. We certainly found that they had much to teach us. The project involved professional learning. We assessed the children and we observed classrooms, and we also asked teachers to reflect on their practices. So here's a student in this classroom, one of the classrooms that we were observing. And this inclusion story has a very happy ending because this student wasn't having a good time in her previous school and moved to this, and there were dramatic changes. So here's our student with Down syndrome right here, but it's hard to spot her. She's just in the midst of a busy classroom. The teacher taught the whole class and the student as well, who was there in the midst of the class. She then broke into groups, but the groups weren't particularly selected to have the student with the intellectual disability. Students were able to move flexibly, but she did have a requirement. So one student who needed the help, she knew the kid didn't want to be in that group, but she said, all right, but you've got to show me that you know how to do this before you can move to the other group. And she is working with the group, and she's teaching the student alongside other peers. One of the adjustments was the use of the calculator. The student found the class calculator not very helpful at all, but the teacher didn't just, well, that's no good, and leave it be. She went searching for an iPad app, and she came up with this talking calculator. And I think this is one of the markers that teachers recognise a need and go looking, and they work until they find what they're looking for. Occasionally, the teacher had a learning support assistant, and here they are doing a quick catch-up. She hasn't even had a chance to put a bag down. This is right at the beginning of the lesson, few minutes. Melanie's planned the lesson, and she's worked out what she would like the learning support assistant to do, and she's there making it clear what the mathematical focus of the lesson is and what she would like the student to do. And there she is, again, working in that classroom. She's sitting near the student, but not right next to her, velcroed on. She's also in close catching position to help the student hear the boy to her right, who also needs her assistance.
So thank you for being involved in the project. We've learned a tremendous amount from you, and
That's
so
great,
we're very pleased that you.
And I've learned heaps from you guys as well. Because I thought at the beginning of the year, what am I going to do? You know, like it's so overwhelming. Not really sure what direction to go in. So, yeah, just learning what I learnt from you guys has really helped.
And what would those key things be that you pass on to somebody else?
To relax, really, is the first one, and to, I guess, to gain an understanding that it's not going to be the same every day, and that's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it. And the learning will happen, but it's a lot slower, and the gains might be really, really small. And sometimes it's about the concept. It's understanding that this thing is longer than that thing, rather than measuring that this thing is exactly 20 centimetres long and this thing is only 3 centimetres long. You know, it's that general concept and that general approach to things rather than the detail. I think that has been the most significant for me.
In terms of the leader's role in all of this, and some of you are in leadership positions, my colleague Glenys Mann once coined it, is it the will, the skill, or what's in the till? Is it about the will to do inclusive practice? Is it having the skill to be able to do it? Or is it about the money and the resources? It would seem from research about leadership, it's not about what's in the till. Most of these adjustments don't cost very much at all. Certainly there's skill required, but a lot of our very competent teachers developed their skill as they had the opportunity, and most of them have never had a student with Down syndrome before and may never have another student again. But what they had was very, very fine teaching skill. They certainly had the will, and that for many of the researchers, and certainly it was evident in our study, these were people who really, really wanted inclusion to work. They really valued the student there and saw that it was something that they wanted to be able to do. So in terms of role of a leader, it's about providing the best opportunity for all the students. So this then leads into an inclusive school culture, and so inclusion in this case is then not seen as a disability but as a whole of school issue. And this comes back to why it is that good inclusive schools are good schools in general. So then here we have something, a statement from UNESCO, the United Nations body about looking at education. And it's not simply about making schools available for those who are already able to get to them. And that's one of the things around the world, is trying to think about how we make schools welcoming to all. So if we're thinking about inclusive schools, what leaders need to consider is setting the vision, then developing these plans of how they're going to make it happen. Then they also need to think about using staff in ways that will make inclusive education environments and really making a difference. So building teams is very important in this work, because it's not the teacher in isolation who's going to be able to meet the needs of all the learners in the class. They need to be able to access support. Providing opportunities for learning for staff is one of those very important ways, and it's really an overt way of saying we expect inclusion to work. We will provide help for you to make it work. And if you need help and support, it's not the child's fault and it's not your fault, but it does need to be something that you work towards. And then a school leader needs to be involved in monitoring and adjusting programs. Then all of people are working together to have a climate of belonging. So there's that idea about belonging again, that people are all important and will be missed. So if we're thinking about what are curriculum expectations, we've referred to previously about the distinction between teaching life skills or academic skills. And in my view, academic skills are fundamentally important to preparing people for adulthood. That's why we teach them in schools. And we don't ask the other kids in Year 9 whether they're ever going to use trigonometry again, or if they're ever going to need the elements of the periodic table. But we teach those things because we believe that they're part of a good education. I believe that's the case for students with disabilities as well. And we certainly know that low expectations have had a terrible effect on student learning. If we've had low expectations, then students can easily live up to them. We really need to set our expectations high. This coming back over and over again to the access to the general curriculum, we do know, regardless of ability, that matters. That's worth a clear point to remember, that it actually is part of research. We know that matters. But we also need to make the modifications. We can't just throw them into the classroom, teach to the middle, and hope that something will happen. And this is Karen's suggestion: try another way. That if it doesn't work, first thing we do, we try another way. And I think as teachers, we're used to doing that. But sometimes it's easy to forget if we have students who their learning is more challenging. Here's something to refer to thinking about the Australian curriculum. So this is this chronological age, the age-appropriate curriculum, thinking about what year level they're in. And then we're going to unpack this in coming lectures. So we're going to be thinking about learning content there's general capabilities, that's a really critical part, and then coming up with individual learning goals that are out of that learning area. So we're going to be doing that in the next weeks to come. And then you've got to assess as they go. Some of the things that people have done with assessments are really creative. I think it's easier or more familiar for primary teachers to do this. Secondary teachers, particularly if they're working towards external assessments, can find it confronting to do it. However, all states and territories in Australia do have provisions for assessment adjustments, even on external exams. As the Australian curriculum is a very recent innovation, there's been a review, and as you'd be aware, the different versions that are on the ACARA website show version dates, and it is a constantly evolving and updating document. One of the things that's been of significance in the change is a real focus on learners with disabilities, and particularly learners who have intellectual disabilities, and trying to make it a curriculum for all Australians. One of the areas where there's a challenge is for learners who have severe disabilities that perhaps their needs may not seem to be being met. There's some conversation around that about how we get curriculum for people working towards levels, but there's also very innovative practice around making the curriculum accessible at various levels, even right into the secondary school. It certainly does take a lot of work in designing a curriculum in those contexts, and considerable expertise as well. And people are working in this space right now, so it's a fascinating time to be exploring these ideas. So if we think about what we've been covering and talking about tonight, it's really been the start of this thought about inclusive curriculum practice. We talk about inclusion as about education for all. So it's not about identifying the odd one out in the classroom. It's really about thinking about all our learners and then meeting them where they are. We would argue that special education is not a place but a process. So all learners in inclusive classrooms need to have their education requirements met, and for some that requires specialist attention, and that's where we think special education comes to the fore. Effective inclusive practice is an achievable goal. There's been decades now of research in how this is done, but we're still learning all the time. And for those of you in leadership roles, you've got a very important position, because it's very clear in a lot of the research how important the school leader is, and providing the environment for setting policies, for really being the role model and demonstrating that inclusive education is what the school's about. And we would argue, and will continue to work on this theme over the course, that the Australian curriculum is the place to start. So I suggest that you now take time to reflect and think about the implications for you and your practice. And so in conclusion, it does seem clear that the relevant teaching approaches and pedagogical adaptations within supportive school environments constitutes the key. So that's the thing, it's got to be within a supportive school environment. Then you get on with altering the curriculum as needed, and you consider your teaching approaches. It's a really important part of inclusive education, and we look forward to continuing the discussion over these next few weeks.